through this pandemic, no one will be safe, and it's in our interest to work very closely to overcome the scourge of COVID-19 in all our countries. Just briefly looking to the future, we have already achieved so much through the elevation of our relationship, and the flow-on effects continue. But as you know, our relationship goes beyond government-to-government cooperation. The work of our research and educational institutions is fundamental to the Indonesia relationship, and it has been for many decades. Our universities connect our people, help us explore new ways of thinking, and provide a safe space for debate and discussion around our future. It is through the Centre for Australian Studies that I hope to see much of this work looking at our shared future and our shared challenges that we can explore together. I also look forward to reading the research papers and academic articles that the Centre for Australian Studies will soon be sharing about these aspects of our relationship, as well as joining future dialogues and events that explore Australia and its relationship with Indonesia, our past, present, and our future. So on that note, terima kasih dan semoga sukses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stephen Scott, for the opening speech. And now we are going to hear the next opening speech by the Ambassador Indonesia for Australia in Canberra. Please, everyone, welcome His Excellency Yohanes Kristiadarto Suryo-Legowo.
Selamat pagi semuanya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May the blessing of Allah Almighty be always upon all of us. Yang saya hormati Dr. Suryono Effendi, selaku Wakil Rektor Universitas Nasional, a good friend of mine, Pak Stephen Scott, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. How are you, Pak? Pak Hari Darwawan, selaku Ketua Pusat Studi Australia. I would like to recognize also a good friend of mine, the President of the Indonesian Australia Business Council, Pak John Iwan Marantika. I would like to recognize also the presence of Professor Richard Schoffel, Professor Paul Astan, and also Professor David Reeve. And I would like to acknowledge also all the participants of the event of soft launching the Center for Australian Studies in the University of Universitas Nasional of Indonesia. Well, first of all, allow me to address my fellow Indonesian in Bahasa Indonesia, because since the very beginning, I understand 99% of the participants are my fellow Indonesian, and I believe all of my Australian friends participating in this event, they are all eloquent in their bahasa Indonesia. Ibu dan Bapak sekalian, puji dan syukur tentunya kita panjatkan kepada Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, Tuhan yang Maha Kuasa, karena berkat rahmat-Nya pada siang hari ini, sore hari ini waktu Canberra, siang hari waktu Indonesia, kita masih diberikan kesehatan sehingga kita semuanya dapat mengikuti acara soft launching dari The Center for Australian Studies in Universitas Nasional. Selaku pihak yang ikut diberikan amanah oleh negara untuk dapat mengelola hubungan Indonesia dan Australia, saya sangat menyambut baik sekali didirikannya Pusat Studi Australia di Universitas Nasional. Sebagaimana kita ketahui, Pusat Studi Indonesia senantiasa terdapat hampir di setiap universitas yang terkemuka di Australia ini. Ada di Australian National University, Monash University, di University of Western Australia, di Melbourne University, di Sydney University, hampir di semua universitas yang terkemuka di Australia ini selalu ada studi mengenai Indonesia. Dan menurut saya hal ini sangat logis sekali. Karena Indonesia dan Australia adalah karena Australia senantiasa punya arti yang sangat strategis bagi Indonesia, dan juga Indonesia punya arti yang sangat strategis bagi Australia. Australia secara geografis sangat berdekatan dengan Indonesia. Oleh karena itu, saya kira kita tidak mempunyai pilihan lain selain menjalin hubungan yang baik antara Indonesia dan Australia. Indonesia harus menjadi aset bagi Australia. Dan sebaliknya Australia juga harus menjadi aset bagi Indonesia. Satu hal yang tidak kita inginkan jika kita menjadi liability bagi satu sama lainnya. Dan kita sangat beruntung karena para pemimpin negara kita sangat menyadari hal ini, dan tadi sudah disampaikan juga oleh Pak Scott bahwa para pemimpin kita sudah bahkan meningkatkan level hubungan bilateral kita dari yang semula sifatnya comprehensive partnership menjadi comprehensive strategic partnership. Dan ini dilakukan pada bulan Agustus tahun 2018. Pada waktu itu Perdana Menteri Australia Pak Scott Morrison berkunjung ke Indonesia kurang dari 1 minggu setelah beliau terpilih menjadi Perdana Menteri Australia. Dan tidak hanya itu saja, pada tanggal 5 Juli tahun 2020 ketika kita dilanda pandemik, kita masih mampu melihat the entry into force of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Saya kira capaian ini bukan merupakan sesuatu yang kita capai dalam semalam, tidak. Ini merupakan hasil kerja keras dari semua pemangku kepentingan. Dan ini bukan sesuatu yang, this is not something that we can take it for granted. Oleh karena itu merupakan upaya kita bersama untuk dapat senantiasa memeliharanya dan senantiasa memperkuatnya. Salah satu elemen yang disebut dalam Comprehensive Strategic Partnership yang tadi sudah disinggung oleh Pak Scott juga adalah connecting people. Itu ada di pilar kedua dari Comprehensive Strategic Partnership kita. Bahwa hubungan antara Indonesia dan Australia tidak hanya ditentukan pada tataran pemerintahan ke pemerintahan, G2G. Tapi saya kira P2P telah ditetapkan juga menjadi salah satu pilar dalam Comprehensive Strategic Partnership antara Indonesia dan Australia. Dan salah satu syarat agar kita mampu memajukan hubungan antara masyarakat kedua negara adalah meningkatkan saling pengertian di antara kedua masyarakat kita. Oleh karena itu senantiasa menjadi kepentingan kita bersama. Sekali lagi menjadi kepentingan kita bersama untuk dapat meningkatkan literasi di kalangan masyarakat Indonesia, literasi mengenai Australia, literasi mengenai pentingnya hubungan antara Indonesia dan Australia, dan sebaliknya juga meningkatkan literasi di kalangan masyarakat Australia tentang Indonesia dan juga tentang pentingnya hubungan antara Indonesia dan Australia. Oleh karena itulah Kedutaan Besar Republik Indonesia di Australia senantiasa menyambut baik berbagai macam pusat studi yang didirikan di berbagai universitas yang ternama di Australia sebagaimana yang saya telah sebutkan tadi. Dan untuk mereciprocate inisiatif-inisiatif yang telah dilakukan oleh berbagai universitas di Australia pada sejak tahun 2019 dengan dukungan juga dari Kedutaan Besar Australia di Jakarta, KBRI Canberra telah menginisiasi penyelenggaraan Australia Update sebagaimana yang telah dilakukan oleh Australian National University di Canberra setiap tahunnya. Pada tahun 2019 kita bekerja sama dengan Universitas Gadjah Mada, pada tahun 2020 kita bekerja sama dengan Universitas Hasanuddin, dan pada tahun 2021 ini kita sangat terbuka jika nantinya kita dapat menyelenggarakan Australia Update ini dengan Universitas Nasional. Dan saya ingin katakan dan saya ingin tekankan bahwa yang menjadi karakter dari Australia Update yang diinisiasi oleh Kedutaan Besar Republik Indonesia di Canberra dengan menggandeng kerjasama universitas yang ada di Indonesia adalah menebarkan positivity. Sekali lagi saya katakan, menebarkan dan menyebarkan positivity mengenai Australia dan juga positivity mengenai hubungan bilateral antara Indonesia dan Australia. Mudah-mudahan dengan demikian hal ini dapat meningkatkan literasi masyarakat Indonesia terkait pentingnya Australia bagi Indonesia, dan dengan demikian kita juga bisa memahami pentingnya hubungan bilateral yang perlu dijalin oleh Indonesia dan Australia. Australia, sebagaimana kita ketahui, senantiasa memberikan dukungan bagi Indonesia ketika kita menghadapi berbagai macam kesulitan. Kita tidak pernah lupa apa yang dilakukan Australia ketika Aceh dilanda tsunami. Kita tidak pernah lupa juga dukungan yang sekarang dilakukan oleh Australia ketika kita sedang menghadapi pandemi COVID-19. Tapi di sisi yang lain juga Indonesia senantiasa juga memberikan bantuan dukungan kepada Australia, khususnya ketika Australia dilanda bushfire pada tahun 2009 dan juga ketika bushfire melanda Australia di tahun 2019 hingga awal 2020. Pak Jokowi dalam pidato beliau pada saat beliau berkunjung ke Australia pada bulan Februari tahun 2020, beliau secara spesifik menyampaikan bahwa friends in need is friends indeed. Dan saya kira itulah yang nantiasa akan menjadi nature dari hubungan antara Indonesia dan Australia. Kemakmuran Indonesia merupakan kepentingan Australia, dan kemakmuran Australia saya rasa merupakan kepentingan Indonesia. Sekali lagi terima kasih atas inisiatif pembentukan Pusat Studi Australia di Universitas Nasional. Mudah-mudahan ke depan hubungan Indonesia dan Australia akan menjadi lebih kuat lagi. Once again, thank you so much for participating in this event, but more importantly, thank you so much for being part of the better relations between Indonesia and Australia. Tuhan memberkati kita semua. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much, His Excellency, for the opening speech. And now we're going to hear the last opening speech by National Presidents of IABC, or known as Indonesia-Australia Business Council. Please welcome Mr. George Iwan Marantika.
Terima kasih Ibu Gabriela Kezia sebagai MC. Thank you everyone. It's a great honor to be able to come after the distinguished ambassador of the Republic Indonesia in Canberra, my good friend from my old town, where ambassador is from, and that is Yogyakarta. Ambassador, Your Excellency, Bapak Kristiarto Legowo. Thank you, sir. It is also an honor, and I'd like to recognize, obviously, to be here with the head of the Center for Australian Studies, Bapak Dr. Hari Darmawan. And also I would like to recognize the Vice Rector of University Nasional, Bapak Dr. Suryono Effendi. Friends, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you all. Distinguished speakers, obviously from distinguished universities. So salute to University Nasional, yes, salute. You have brought in, I think, one of the top 3 universities, not only in Australia, but in the world, yeah? Yaitu Professor Paul Astan from University of Technology, Sydney, Australia, Professor Richard Chevay from Melbourne University, and Professor David Rees from University of New South Wales, Australia. And also I'd like to recognize Professor Rizky Marman Saputra, who will be the moderator. Saya akan coba bicara bilingual ya, karena ini I see my friends also from IABC joining. Jadi teman-teman saya dari IABC juga bergabung di sini, such as Pak David Sutanto, Pak Peter Fanning, the founding board members of IABC, the past president of IABC also here, Pak Chris Solisto. I see our friends Kevin Evans from AIC, Professor, also Jennifer Matthews coming from AIBC, Western Australia. And also I see from AIBC also Jeff Parker. So I'll be very brief in this remarks. Saya akan sangat singkat dalam sambutan ini, tapi saya akan coba kasih perspektif IABC. So in this brief remarks, I'll try to sort of share the perspective of IABC from the topic that we have today, and that is the Indonesian-Australian relations, the past, the present, and the future. And I think the past has been very skillfully elaborated by Mr. Stephen Scott, the Deputy Chief Mission of the Australian Embassy. Hello, sir. I think this is the first time we've engaged. Thank you for joining, and I think you've skillfully elaborated the past relations with Indonesia and Australia, including our ambassador in Canberra, Ambassador Chris Legowo. Jadi sangat baik tadi disampaikan oleh Pak Stephen Scott, Deputy Chief Mission dari Australian Embassy. And now my focus probably will be at the present and the future, in which in the past you heard from Stephen Scott, Australia was very instrumental in our independence. Kita dengar dari Pak Stephen Scott, Australia sangat mempunyai peran yang besar dalam kemerdekaan Republik Indonesia. Dan kemudian berkembang hubungan yang sangat kuat aspek elemen trade. Kita lihat perdagangan juga menjadi sangat kuat dari 45 ke atas. We saw also the relationship in terms of the trades relationship became very significant. Obviously from agricultural to various aspects of trade has been very significant. In terms of the Indonesian-Australian relations, energy, coal, and whatnot. But this is very important and it will continue to be important. Nah, aspek perdagangan itu sangat penting dan akan terus menjadi penting. Tetapi menurut saya, I think the two most crucial elements, dua elemen yang sangat crucial di dalam proses the present and the future, kita akan melihat di tahun 2021 ini. Karena per hari ini, dan ini congratulations to Universitas Nasional ya. As of today, the 5th of July, we are celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the Indonesia. Indonesia Australian Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement 5 Juli 2020. Suatu perjuangan selama lebih dari 10 tahun ya Pak Dubes Legowo ya. 10 tahun lebih. Yeah, it was 10 years of discussion, dialogues, and IABC was highly involved from the beginning, from 2020 from 2010, 2011, all the way to the entry into force in 2020 of the IACPA. And today, 5th of July, 1 tahun persis. Jadi ini sekali lagi kudos for University National. You beat everybody to the punch. Selamat kepada Universitas Nasional karena pada tanggal 5 Juli ini, persis 5 Juli ini 1 tahun dari ratifikasi dari entry into force Indonesia Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Dan buat teman-teman ya kawan-kawan dari UNAS dan all of the academics here, in my viewpoint, that is one of the most strategic economic partnerships that Indonesia has as of today. One of the most strategic economic partnership that Indonesia has as of today. And so if you look at the present, that is the big, you might say, elephant in the room. The IACPA implementation. The implementasi dari kerjasama ekonomi Indonesia-Australia adalah item terbesar dari hubungan Indonesia-Australia saat ini. Dan itu tantangan kita semua bersama. And that is a challenge for all of the stakeholders. The governments, government of Republic of Indonesia, government of Australia, the business community, IABC, the business community in Australia, the business community in Indonesia, and also the academia, higher education, the triple helix, or pentahelix now they call it. Yeah. It is our challenge together to see through this implementation, achieve the vision and the mission of the IACPA. And what lies the future? Masa depannya bagaimana? It is in this implementation that we can see the future of the Indonesia-Australia relations. And what would that future look like? Within the IACPA, we still have all of the main elements that are very strong in terms of the current relationship, trade. Ya, masih kuat hubungan perdagangan itu. We see also the other aspects that are very strong, but I think the most important aspect of the IACPA is exactly what you are all about. That's what the Center for Australian Studies is all about. And that is the convergence of people-to-people relations. And that convergence in terms of a business economic aspect, I call it together. The future of Indonesia and Australia is welcome to the new economy. Jadi bersama-sama kita menyambut ekonomi baru. And what is the new economy? The new economy shall be the convergence of the knowledge economy. Jadi tadi pertama sudah disampaikan oleh Bapak Duta Besar kita di Canberra bahwa hubungan pendidikan perguruan tinggi dengan Indonesia, Australia sangat-sangat kuat. Sangat kuat, terkuat buat Indonesia sebenarnya. Di antara semua negara-negara di dunia, paling kuat hubungan pendidikan dan pendidikan tinggi adalah Australia, kalau dilihat dari kerjasama-kerjasama yang ada. Tetapi bagaimana dari hubungan pendidikan tinggi menjadi hubungan knowledge economy, sehingga mempunyai peranan aktual ke dalam ekonomi, real economy. And so how we converge this knowledge economy together, obviously driven by the convergence of the digital economy. That's the new economy. And the third, the convergence of the knowledge economy between Indonesia and Australia, the convergence of the digital economy. And the third, and this is COVID impact, the convergence of the health-oriented economy. Economies that prioritize on health. Health becomes preeminent. Kesehatan menjadi sekarang yang utama. Dan bagaimana kita bisa converge, menciptakan usaha-usaha baru yang berorientasi dengan faktor kesehatan sebagai yang utama. Inilah tiga mungkin priority atau future yang kita bisa lihat dari IACPA implementation. So, two aspects that I'm focusing on in these remarks, and that is the present and the future. The present is IACPA implementation. The challenge is, can we make it happen? And the answer is, yes, we can make it happen. But we have to work hard. Kita harus kerja keras. The second is the future. The future, yes, the current economies will continue to happen. The trades, everything will grow. But you might say the cherry on the pie will be the human capital development, the human capital convergence. Bagaimana sumber daya manusia profesional Indonesia dan Australia bisa bekerja sama menyambut ekonomi baru yang kita hadapi ini, yaitu ekonomi post-COVID-19. So, the new economy will be the challenge that together with Indonesia, Australia, the business community, the education community, the governments together, how we together can work together, Indonesia and Australia, to be able to overcome and, in fact, be able to succeed in the new economy. And I think we can achieve that task. Dan untuk itu kita IABC ingin mengundang semua teman-teman yang ada di sini. Kita akan ada celebration dari IACPA tanggal 13 Juli. Dan kemudian tanggal 27 Juli juga kita akan ada diskusi mengenai IACPA. Jadi nanti lewat sekretariat IABC, Pak Arfad bisa membantu untuk memberikan informasi yang lebih detail kepada kawan-kawan semua. Jadi 13 Juli dan 27 Juli kita ingin mengundang kawan-kawan semua. So we also want to all invite you all because this is IACPA month. This is the IACPA celebration month, a 1-year anniversary of IACPA. And IABC would like to invite you on the 13th of July and the 27th of July. We'll have a discussion on how we can see the challenges of the present and then also succeed for the future together, Indonesia, Australia, people to people, business, higher education, government, together we can work together. Thank you very much. And again, thank you, University Nacional, for inviting us on this very distinguished panel. And I would like to, again, congratulate University Nacional for launching the Center for Australian Studies. And we are more than happy to work with you on how to advance the future discussion and dialogues. And as Ambassador Chris Lagoa has mentioned, the literature is very important between Indonesia and Australia. Thank you very much. I give the floor back to the Masters of Ceremony, Ibu Gabriela Kezia.
Thank you so much for the speech, Mr. George. And also thank you for all of the welcoming speech for our honorable guest. Now we are on this event core. Before I end over this event, we want to remind to all the participants during the webinar, please always turn on your camera and use the virtual background that we provide. For the question and answer sessions, please list your name on the chat room in Zoom, or you can just raise hand in the in this feature room Zoom. And now, please welcome our moderator for today, Mr. Rizky Marman Saputra, MSE.
Hello, thank you, Kezia. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sorry, Kezia, do you hear my voice? Is it clear?
Yes, it's clear, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening. May peace be upon us all. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the honorable speaker, colleagues, friends, and participants. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rizky Marman Saputra. I'm glad to have a chance to be a moderator during this event. Today we are going to discuss about Indonesia-Australia relation, past, present, and future. The topics of this webinar will discuss about Australia-Indonesia relation, past, present, and future in the first webinar organized by the Center for Australian Studies, UNAS. The discussion this webinar will focus on the potentially strategy of the Australia-Indonesia proved by the harmonization of relationship in the past and in the current condition, and the effort improvement for the future. The stability of Australia-Indonesia relation is a guarantee within this area. A comprehensive, multidisciplinary, and sustainable approach is needed for the harmonization between Australia and Indonesia. The contribution of all related elements is required for which can complete each other. We got to show you we have an honorable guest. We have an honorable speaker, Paul Alton, the first speaker. Paul Alton is a adjunct professor of public history at the UTS. Was founding a co-director of both the Australian Center for Public History and the Center for Creative Practice and Cultural Economy, and also the director of UTS shop from 20,002 till 2050,000. A unit that continues to work with the community groups. His publication include what is public history globally, Bloomsbury 2020, and Making History, the Greater 2020 and 20. He is also founding a co-editor of the journal Public History Review and the editor chair of the University Community Engagement Journal Gateways. Paul Austin is our advisor at CFIS UNAS. And then the second or honorable speaker is Professor Richard Soffel. Professor Richard Soffel has a research interest in Indonesia history and politics. Richard is a professor in the University of Melbourne, Australia, and an advisor also in CFIS UNAS. The third honorable speaker is Professor David Reeve. He was a founding lecturer in the Australian Studies program at the University of Indonesia in 1980s, and he had a 3-year stretch at University of Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta and University Muhammadiyah Malang in the 1990s. As a resident director for the ICCS program, which takes Australian students to Indonesian university. He has written on Indonesian politics, Indonesian language, the Indonesian diaspora, and in Australia-Indonesia relation, and also advisor of the CFIS UNAS. So we are going to our first speaker, Professor Paul Astan. Hello, Professor Paul Astan.
Hello, thank you very much.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you very much.
Happy to having you here. Yeah.
My pleasure.
Well, Astan, I give the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to acknowledge all of the people who are formally here. Professor Sinango, His Excellency Lagawa, Mr. Marantika, Stephen Scott, Professor Reeve, Professor Chevelle, Mr. Damawan, and our moderator. It's an honour to be asked to be an advisor for the Centre for Australian Studies. While I work in Australian history, I'm primarily a public historian, and I'm hoping to contribute to the Centre through public history. It was great to hear Stephen talking about the past, because public history is very much about using the past in the present and engaging with publics and engaging with communities. And I thought I'd just talk a little bit about public history. So what is public history today? Definitions of public history have evolved over the past 4 to 5 decades. Some choose to represent it narrowly, often to the exclusion of people without formal academic training in history. Others, say that it is an impossible term that is too broad and elastic. It can be stretched over almost anything. But a more expansive and generous characterisation sees public history as a process by which the past is constructed into history, and a practice which has the capacity for involving people as well as nations and communities in the creation of their own histories. Discussion of the process is an integral part of the practice of public history in this definition. So we need to talk about what we're looking at the past, how we're looking at it, who's looking at it, and why. But however defined, two things are clear. Public history is a complex, nuanced, non-traditional field that is multi and cross-disciplinary, and it is rapidly emerging around the world. It's perhaps, I'd say, the fastest growing field of history today. Publishers are going mad with public history at the moment. Undoubtedly, debates about the nature of public history will continue into the future, though some have questioned the utility of constantly debating it. These will be shaped by specificities in particular countries and cultures, but public history has come of age. Public historians and others have developed institutional and other infrastructure in many countries around the world, including Australia, Canada, Britain, Italy, New Zealand, Scandinavia, South Africa, and increasingly in Indonesia. My colleague and friend Kresno has been doing a lot of public history promotion in Indonesia. Founded in 2010, the International Federation for Public History provides a network of public history programs, academics, and practitioners, and produces a refereed journal, the International Public History. Academic and other publishers have also embraced the field, as have cultural institutions of all modes and sizes, including museums, libraries, archives, and national parks. Public history is a really good way, again, as Stephen pointed out, to get conversations going and get people talking about issues and the importance of the past in the present. American public historian Patricia Mooney Melvin noted over 20 years ago that for many professional historians, the definition of historian is treated as a fixed category, unrelated to time and place. The only time and place of importance in the defining process, at least as far as the professional historical community is concerned, is that of the period when the professionalisers construct of historians emerge and took root. She was concerned with the dynamic tensions between the past, the present, and the future, and of the opportunities as well as the constraints in the culture inherent in those tensions for professional historians, both inside and outside the Academy. I've worked in the Academy in Australia for over 25 years, and I've also been a freelance historian for 15, and have worked with communities and with other institutions and organisations for most of my career. More recently, Australian historian Marnie Hughes Warrington has noted that there is no history apart from historical practices, nor is there any logical, universal or unchanging reason to talk of one practice as more historical than another. Our views on what history is are themselves historical and are subject to re-evaluation and change. While public history has come of age, it has done so at a time of great uncertainty in a world that changes constantly. COVID's hit everyone, and it's made incredible impacts on universities across the world, as we all know. Old binaries of producer, consumer of history and of professional and amateur have blurred in a post-colonial digital world. Historical authority, which was monopolised by academics in the mid-20th century, has been more democratised, though democratisation itself is an unstable process. Neoliberal managerialism also continues to undermine the role and practice of history in most of its manifestations in many countries, including Australia, and this is particularly in universities in our country. Jorma Kalala argues convincingly that academic historians need to see themselves in part as consultants. Academic history is very important, it's often foundational to the way people construct their own pasts, but I think he's right. We need to see ourselves in part as consultants. Rather than just transmitting knowledge of the past, he wrote, it is our task also to encourage and support other people engaged with history making and to be available when assistance is requested. Some historians have stepped up to these challenges. They've acknowledged that historical knowledge and consciousness have multiple sources in film, in documentaries, in public art, heritage, exhibitions, historical novels, family community history, reenactments, and in schools as well as universities. Established in 2011, for example, History Pin has shared hundreds and thousands of sources and memories with thousands of archives, libraries and museums. Taking a lead from citizen science, citizen history, which I think is a really important thing to think about for this centre, is booming across the world. As Alana Piper has written, a colleague of mine at UTS, digital humanities are revolutionising the way that history is transmitted to, received by, and perhaps most importantly, performed with public communities. History from above is no longer sustainable, but this does not mean privileging history from below. Rather, there is a strong and growing recognition that history in general comprises a wide spectrum of practices across a vast number of agents, actors and audiences, none of which are necessarily superior to one another. Public history will continue to evolve in different places, in different ways and for different reasons. Conciliation, reconciliation, renewal, whether it's cultural or economic, recognition and revival. Some speculate that the term public history may perhaps disappear if it's stretched too far. Urban history, for example, dominated Western history profession in the late 1960s and 70s in the context of environmental crisis. It ultimately fragmented and was absorbed into the new social history in the 1980s. I asked some honours students at Sydney Uni a while ago whether anyone had heard of urban history, and not one hand went up. There were 100 students in the lecture theatre. Public history on one level has grown out of rights movements: human, Indigenous, Labour, Green, minority, and will it eventually melt into air? Perhaps public history might be best thought of as an ongoing entangled negotiation, a set of evolving relationships, cultural, economic, environmental, political and social, involving a range of knowledges and a diversity of people, groups and organisations. And I'll close there just showing you these slides. This was an exhibition we did at the Australian Centre for Public History with an Italian cultural organisation in Sydney called Pusat. It was a medium to long-term project on Sydney's Italian fruit shops. And these grocery shops that sell fruit and vegetables were cultural icons in our suburban landscapes for almost a century. So everyone knows them, and they're in all major capital cities. It links in with migration history with a whole range of other things. We devised a program of work with Pusat, undertook the research, engaged the Italian community, involved doctoral and master's students doing research, ran oral history workshops for the public and for the students, collected over 250 photographs and memorabilia, but we wrote academic articles, we generated popular writing in newspapers and magazines, we did radio interviews, and we produced an exhibition which ran for 6 months in the Sydney City Council's historic Customs House in 2010. About 20,000 people saw the exhibition in its life, but it ran for 6 months in Sydney and travelled through regional parts of New South Wales for 2 years. So that was a fairly impactful program of work. Hopefully, we may, in the very near future, be able to start developing some exciting public history projects through the wonderful new Centre for Australian Studies at your university. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Paul Astan. And then we continue with Professor David Reeve. David Reeve, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, of course. Hi, David Reeve, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Oh, good.
Thank you. Have you got my PPT?
Not already, yeah.
Just checking for a moment if it could be screened.
Okay.
Well,
yeah.
Thank you very much. I hope someone will move the slides one by one. Welcome from lockdown in Sydney. Congratulations, particularly to UNAS and particularly to Krishna and Hari Darmawan. And thank you very much to the embassies involved. It seems like the start of a terrific cooperation. So my name is David Reeve from the University of New South Wales, and I arrived in Indonesia almost exactly 52 years ago at a time of very good relations between Australia and Indonesia. And the Australian-Indonesian relations are good now, but though they've been good 52 years ago and 52 years later, they're not always good. And I thought I'd like to mention some of the times there have been ups and downs, because the good times in Indonesia-Australian relations don't happen by chance. They have to be worked at, a great deal of work by concerned bodies on both sides to make the relations good, but they do go up and down, and there have been quite a lot of differences of opinion over the 76 years since Indonesia's independence. So we need to look forward to the troubled times and be ready to handle them, so that the relationship can be deepened and strengthened, but also that troubles can be handled wisely and without damaging lower levels of the relationship. Could I see the next slide? Oh, yes. So I'm David Reeve from Australia. In English, the word is Australia. In Indonesian, it's Australia or atau Australia. In Javanese, I understand it's Asutralia. Asu. Kenapa Asutralia? Apa nggak lebih sopan kalau Segawan Tralia? Where did the word Asutralia came from? If I can see the next slide, it reminds me of a period when I was looking after students in Yogyakarta in 1999, where there was a period of anti-Australian rhetoric in Indonesia over Australia's role with East Timor. And there were students selling anti-Australian T-shirts near UGM in Yogyakarta. This was one anti-Australia. Here's another anti-Australia with a kangaroo being nicely barbecued over a flame, and anti-Asutralia, Asu being the Javanese word for dog, a fairly good term of disrepute. Another slide, this was Aussie, Australia be destroyed, go to hell. Another slide, please. He was a cartoon at the time, an Indonesian cartoon, showing Australia apparently, go back a bit, Australia apparently bearing peace, but looking very big and threatening. So there are times of trouble, and we have to be ready, we have to realize that they will come up, and have come up constantly through the past periods. We have to be ready to handle them. The next one, looking back in the 1940s, Australia certainly eventually came round to being a help to Indonesia, but here was the cartoon. Our press was mostly pro-Dutch, the Indonesian independence being portrayed as a problem causing Australia to call out help. The next slide, Australian Prime Minister offering help to Indonesia. Indonesia looking mengerikan sekali, hitam, Holland kelihatannya cemas. Next slide. Here are the Australian wharfies yang ikut mendukung kemerdekaan Indonesia, sepertinya menjadi budaknya Indonesia. In the 50s, Australia and Indonesia relations were more distant. In the next slide, Indonesia, having had independence, wants Papua. It's being told, can't you be satisfied? Kok tidak pernah puas? Next. Australia mabuk dengan kemerdekaan, ingin dekat dengan Papua. Satu lagi, Australian worries about the growth of the PKI in Indonesia. The next slide, please. Here's a nice Indonesian novel about the Australian-Indonesian relationship, which most people don't know. Idris's novel, published in the 1970s. In this fairy tale, Australia is a small, beautiful princess. Beautiful, but so small one that no one wants to marry her. They look for a husband for her. Next slide, please. But she's fallen in love with an Indonesian, Raden Sukmoro. This causes all sorts of problems within Australian politics, and Idris's novel examines Australia's questions about its place in Asia, its fears and suspicions of Indonesia. Eventually, it's decided that Putri Penelope can marry Raden Sukmoro, but by that time he's looking elsewhere. One more slide, please. Is an Australian novel, Invasion, also from the early 1980s, a comic novel carrying the fear of an invasion of Australia by Indonesia. Another slide, please. But one of the good things about the 1980s was the publication of the book Australia di Mata Indonesia, kumpulan artikel pers Indonesia. Banyak orang Indonesia penting mengunjungi Australia dan menulis artikel. Jadi buku ini berkat terutama kerjanya Krisno Brahmantio. Buku ini diterbitkan tahun 1989 with the full help, I should say, of the Australian Embassy, which very kindly and very sensibly recognized that for the book to be useful, there had to be critical articles of Australia in it. So this was not propaganda, but a good collection of articles and attitudes, critical and praising of Australia. Next slide, please. In this book, there were several cartoons from Om Basikom, Indonesian cartoons, showing the kangaroo looking at the Great Garuda, looking rather worried and anxious. Next, please. Here is the fear from Indonesia, Om Basikom, that behind a nice face, di belakang muka yang bagus dan bersahabat, ada Australia yang mengerikan dan agresif. Next, please. Ini kritikan terhadap pers bebas Australia yang sepertinya tidak mempedulikan siapa yang akan dicemarkan olehnya. Next, please. Publications in Australia that made Indonesia angry. Next. Australia membesarkan kelemahan yang ada pada pihak Indonesia. Next, please. Dan Australia kelihatannya besar, tapi punya gangguan sendiri, persoalan aborigin. The next, turis Australia digambarkan sebagai monyet. Australia biasanya digambarkan sebagai koala, kanguru, anjing, atau monyet. Satu lagi, tapi Australia juga digambarkan sering melihat Asia sebagai tempat yang sangat kaya dan Australia harus ikut dengannya. Selalu ingat bahwa media itu menggambarkan perasaan-perasaan yang ada di dalam masyarakat, tapi juga ikut memperkuat atau menentukan. Gambaran kartun Indonesia tentang Papua, apa sebaiknya Papua mendengarkan nasihat baik dari malaikat Indonesia atau setannya bisikan-bisikan jahat dari Australia. Terus ini gambar tentang Paul Keating. Indonesia kelihatannya sesuatu bukan bayi tapi bisa mengancam. Satu lagi, Indonesian cooking, masakan Indonesia seperti Australia, ikan kecil akan digoreng. Dalam media kita bisa melihat prasangka-prasangka, perasaan, ketakutan kedua negara mempunyai unsur yang merasa bahwa negara lainnya adalah ancaman. Ini sesuatu yang harus ditangani. Di sini Australia mungkin mau ikut dengan Asia, tapi kalau menjadi gangguan akan digigit di kemudian hari, dimakan habis. The next one, please. Dan Australia tentu saja tidak hanya Indonesia yang dikritik dalam kartun Australia. Ini kartun Australia yang menggambarkan Australia sebagai negara yang kritik dan mengancam dengan suara yang keras, tapi mempunyai bagasi atau keberatan sendiri dalam bentuk rasisme. Okay, thank you. I've been asked to finish with some suggestions about the opportunities and the challenges. There are so many opportunities because Indonesia is very important to Australia now, more important than Australia is to Indonesia. It's best if they can become assets, as Pak Legowo said, but Indonesia will become stronger, richer, much richer and more powerful in the future. So if Indonesia is important to Australia now, it will become even more important in the next 30 to 50 years when it will become a great power. Australia must become an asset to this nation of Indonesia, and hopefully Australia as an asset to Indonesia. But there will always be problems, the misunderstandings. I've shown you a history of periods where there were misunderstandings and the relationship had to be repaired. But they can be repaired with people like people at the Australian Studies Centre at Universitas Nasional to examine the good times and the bad times. What I think in my saran for the new centre, it's very important that Australian studies centres in Indonesia be linked up with similar groups in Australia, not just with the Indonesianists like myself and Richard. We can be helpful, but it's so good that Professor Astan is here, hopefully of a start of the Australian studies at UNAS, linking up with Australian studies centres and figures across Australia, but also in other countries where there are strong Australian studies organisations, like in Japan and India and China, and linking up also with other Australian studies groups in Indonesia. From Hari Darmawan's work, I've learned that there are 88 universities in Indonesia that teach at least something about Australia. That's pretty amazing, 88 universities. But hardly anyone knows this except Harry and me. I wish someone somewhere more important would know this and try and do something with it, so there could be more of a structure to Australian studies in Indonesia, like there is in India, like there is in China, like there is in Japan. So it's these sort of opportunities that I hope will be grasped at. I know one thing I can mention is that from the 14th to the 16th of July, there's a conference, the Indonesia Council Open Conference, being held by Zoom at the University of Queensland, which is focused on building sustainable research links between Indonesia and Australia. And I know that members of the staff at UNAS are going to take part in that endeavour. The last one I should mention is a book that's about to come out. That was my second last slide. If we can go just back one slide. If not, there's a book coming out, Indonesia di Mata Australia, Indonesia di Mata Australia, by my old colleague Ahmad Kushairi of the Universitas Jember, and that is a good analysis of the way in which Australian-Indonesian relations can be studied across the depth and the breadth of broad policy and the struggles between organizations that create policy. So let me end here and say thank you very much again. Best wishes from lockdown in Sydney. We understand a bit of what lockdown is like. Congratulations to UNAS. Thank you particularly to Paul Astan for providing that link with Australian studies of Australia. So important. Thank you to Krishna and Hari Darmawan and to the universities and ambassadors here today. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Prof. David Reed from New South Wales University. It's a cool presentation. The what we call the cartoon of your presentation is is quite funny. And so we are going to our honorable speaker, Prof. Richard Sovell from Melbourne University. Hello, Prof. Richard.
Hello, Pak Rizky. Can you hear my voice?
Yeah, I hear your voice clearly.
Good.
Prof.
I
Richard,
have I have a few slides. If I could try and put them up and see if they work from this distance.
Yeah, please.
You see if it. So to start off, I'd like to express my thanks to Universitas Nasional for the opportunity to speak at this soft opening of the new Australian Studies Centre. I think it's a great initiative, and I think a very timely one to think about the role that universities and university studies can play in the particularly the people-to-people relationships between Indonesia and Australia. I think as Pat David's presentation reminded us, there's always a role for academics both in Australia and Indonesia to analyse the government-to-government relationship. But I think that there is a really important role in how universities can foster, obviously, student-to-student relationships, but more broadly, people-to-people relationships. And I see that is the principal the principal contribution that the Australian Studies Centres at Indonesian universities can play. David has already drawn our attention and reminded us of that earlier 1989 publication, Indonesia, the Australia di Mata Indonesia, and here is one of Om Pasikom's cartoons posing the question, orang Barat dari Selatan atau orang Selatan dari Barat, and whether that question is still pertinent today. But I'd like to sort of start off by asking some questions and posing some thoughts about what sort of role Universitas Nasional has in mind for its Australian Studies Centre. If we look around both universities in Indonesia and in Australia, there are many models of Australian studies programs with different discipline approaches, and how an area studies centre can relate to other departments and discipline departments within the universities. And if we look around, we can see that some of those area studies departments have specialised in the international relations, foreign policy, the bilateral relationship, which I think will always remain important. But David's discussion has highlighted the turbulence, the pasang surut in the bilateral relationship since the days in the years after the proclamation of independence, when the then Australian government was very supportive of Indonesia's struggle for independence by taking the issue with India to the Security Council, and later became a member of the United Nations Commission for Indonesia. So that history is, as David's cartoons illustrated, have had their turbulence. And I think one of the issues that we need to consider are whether the mechanism of government consultations, the comprehensive strategic partnership, the economic partnerships are under the regular ministerial and heads of government meetings are an effective enough structure of government-to-government cooperation to help manage the nearly inevitable differences of opinion about particular issues which have in the past fairly frequently emerged, and how effective these new mechanisms will be in managing those. And I think the range of possible disciplinary focus is much longer than, or much longer list than I've got here. So I think it depends a little bit on how Universitas Nasional sees the relationship between the Australian Studies Centre and its disciplinary departments, and how the Australian Studies Centre and the disciplinary departments can mutually enhance and support each other in the development in studies about Australia. I think we've already had some discussion about the importance of the economic, trade and investment relationships. As we all know, both Australia and Indonesia are members of the G20, but relatively speaking, for two such large economies, the trade and economic relationships are relatively modest. I think it's still the case that Australia does more trade and investment with New Zealand than it does with Indonesia. New Zealand's economy is much smaller than that of Indonesia. So how can we use the economic comprehensive partnership to build up that a greater trade and investment relationship? Just and I don't know, this is quite a suggestion, but it is now a long time since Australia di Mata Indonesia was published. An immense amount of media publications have been published in Indonesian media about Australia. Whether it is something that Universitas Nasional would like to take on to produce a second edition of Australia di Mata Indonesia. I think the contribution of the first edition, I think, is important, and whether we can encourage students and staff at Universitas Nasional to think about producing a second one, I think is hopefully worthy of consideration. But David has talked a lot about the ups and downs of the history of the bilateral relationship. I want to drawing on some of the results of the Lowy Institute poll on Australia-Indonesia relations, which are published every year now. I think it's important, it's a useful source to look at how Australian society's feelings about Indonesia have developed over the last five or so years, while these Lowy Institute polls have been published, and how feelings towards Indonesia compare with other neighbours in Southeast Asia, as well as the major powers in East Asia. And the Lowy Institute uses this idea of a feelings thermometer, and it's Indonesia sits very much in the middle of the table of Australian attitudes towards Indonesia, somewhat well above countries like China, Russia, Iran, Myanmar. North Korea is not mentioned in there, but I think it was at the bottom of the list. But somewhat below Australian feelings towards other ASEAN members, Papua New Guinea and South Korea. And I think somehow Australian popular attitudes towards Indonesia conjure up a mixture of ignorance. So colleagues like David Reed and myself clearly have spent an academic career teaching about Indonesia at Australian universities, haven't been doing necessarily a particularly good job, as the degree of ignorance in the broader society about Indonesia is clearly widespread, which I think the Lowy Institute poll showing that a significant portion of Australian society do not consider that Indonesia is a democracy, and the attitudes of ambivalence that have gone with that, and that is simply a table sort of situating Indonesia as number 4 on that list on the feelings thermometer. And I think from time to time the Lowy Institute also produces data from surveys of Indonesian public opinion about Australia, which I hope Universitas Nasional will be able to use as a data source in its analysis of people-to-people relations with attitudes to Australia. And that again is another graphic from the Lowy Institute poll, showing that the proportion of Australians who consider Indonesia friendly is still significantly greater than those who think of it as unfriendly. But I think the Lowy data continues to remind us that there is a great deal to be done to improve both knowledge in the broader Indonesian and Australian societies, as well as attitudes towards. But I think one of the most important aspects of any studies of the bilateral relationship is how popular opinion interacts with and influences government policy. And some of the cartoons that David showed relating to the first years of the bilateral relationship, where it was the waterside workers together, working together with former political prisoners that the Dutch had brought from Bovendickel to Australia, mounted a boycott of Dutch shipping in trying to support the Dutch endeavour to reoccupy Indonesia. That was the first major instance where a civil society group in Australian society attempted to, and did, I think, partially succeed in influencing government policy towards Indonesia. And we can think of numerous other occasions where that civil society people's involvement and interest in policy towards Indonesia has been a significant influence on the government's conduct of foreign policy towards Indonesia. So sometimes we think about two categories of the bilateral relationship of government to government and people to people. What I'm suggesting that we need to see how these two ways of interaction between Indonesia and Australia do themselves influence each other, and that I think is going on today. And I'd just like my second last comment is to draw your attention to the Defence Strategic Update published in July of last year, and not a formal, fully developed defence white paper. The 2016 is still the current version, but the government was prompted to release an update because of the very significant strategic realignment that was going on with growing tensions between between the United States and China, particularly in the East Asian, Southeast Asian region, where this rethinking of Australian strategic outlook on the region, including Indonesia, what were the implications for Australia's strategic relationship with Indonesia? Looking through that paper, Indonesia was only specifically mentioned once in that paper, and yet the broader thrust of the document was to prioritise engagement and defence relationship with our partners, particularly in Australia's immediate region in Southeast Asia and more broadly in East Asia. So we're left with the challenge to see what was although Indonesia was barely mentioned in that update paper, what are the implications of the general strategic framework as developed in that paper for relations with Indonesia. And just finally, I'm going to briefly raise, again resorting to cartoons, to some of the major issues that came out of a recent survey conducted by the ABC entitled Australia Talking. And here we have, just like to raise a couple of issues which came up in this very broad, systematic survey of changing Australian attitudes. And some of the issues of corruption, international affairs, and climate change were prominent amongst the issues which those surveyed in the Australia Talking survey thought were important. And just move on to go through a few cartoons, not historical ones, which David has already been through very comprehensively, but to look at using cartoons to identify some contemporary and contentious issues. Cartoons, just as David showed with the historical ones, have the capacity to identify issues and attitudes which can be a great basis for discussion, and particularly in an academic framework. So just a couple of issues which I'd like to touch on. The way that relations between the central government in Canberra and the states have been changed by the way that governments at both those levels have endeavoured to manage the COVID pandemic. And what these cartoons suggest is there has been a considerable change in the power relationships between the central government and the states. And I think the way that we have talked about how the Federation works in Australia is that particularly since the Second World War, the Commonwealth, the central government, the Commonwealth government in Canberra has, through a number of reasons, becoming relatively more powerful. I think the way that the governments have tried to manage the pandemic, I think, raises questions about that. The second issue that cartoons touch on is Indigenous society and culture, and third, climate change. But I suspect not all of you have been keenly watching the television broadcast of the Tour de France, the long bicycle race game going through most of France. And here we have on the left-hand side the figure of Prime Minister Scott Morrison about to be run over by the leaders of the states, which conjures up the image about just how effective the leaders, the premiers, the leaders of the state governments have been in sometimes dominating the Commonwealth government's ability to manage the pandemic. And this is another cartoon suggesting the same thing, with Morrison saying we've turned the curve and we're about to get out of it, but he's just about to be subverted and undermined by three of the state premiers. So that this, how this evolves over the remainder of the pandemic, I think, will significantly influence the way that we understand how the Australian Federation works. So to move on to the next one, the issue of Indigenous society, Indigenous culture, and Australian visual recognition of Indigenous societies and a reconciliation with them is a very old issue, and one as this cartoon suggests, and many within the government would prefer it to go away, but it's highly unlikely to do so. And I think, reflecting back on the Australia di Mata Indonesia publication, many of those articles related to Aboriginal society. So I think a newer version of that publication, I'm sure, would show the same concern and same interest by Indonesian writers about Australia. And just finally, the last cartoon can't escape climate change. And here we have, on the left-hand side, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his recently re-elected Deputy Barnaby Joyce, with Morrison trying to argue that the vastly different policies about climate change by the two coalition partners are virtually identical, which is, I think, a good optimistic note to end my comments. So thank you very much. I look forward to working with the new Australian Studies Centre at Universitas Nasional. So thank you.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Prof. Richard Strovel from Melbourne University. Thank you for our honorable speaker. So we are going to make a discussion. We have several questions from our chat book room. First, from Mas Kaisno for Prof. Paul Astan. Professor Paul Astan, could you please tell us your experience when doing a workshop on Australian studies in Universitas Indonesia in the 1996? Probably the same workshop will be available for academic in Universitas Nasional.
Yes, I travelled with Andrew Jakubowicz, who was a colleague at UTS in 96. I think it was the year the clove market was deregulated and the economy collapsed. When I was there, I think the Australian dollar went from getting a 1,500 rupiah for $1 to about 7,000 in 5 days. It was a disaster, but I met a lovely group of young academics at UE, and we had a week teaching. We actually had a month teaching. I did a week on Australian history, and we looked at environmental history, a whole range of things. And there were a lot of similarities between our two countries' histories in a lot of ways. We had other academics coming up, and as both the other professors have said, from different disciplines. We had a journalist come up for a week, a political economist, I can't remember who else, but it was a month-long program, and we developed a graduate certificate around that, and I think it was issued through the University of Technology in Sydney. But it was a wonderful program, and it was a great way to get to know colleagues and to exchange. Kresno and I became quite good friends after all of that. Yeah, so it's actually a really good idea. And with COVID and Zooming, it's probably going to be a lot easier and cheaper to do something like that if people are interested than it was then when we had to fly in and find accommodation and that sort of thing. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Paul.
Right.
Thank you, Paul, Prof. Paul Astan. So we have another question from Alif, Alif Lambang from Universitas Nasional. Maybe to all the speaker, Alif said that apart from terrorism cases that occur around the world, can Australia guarantee security and comfort for students who studying in Australia? Maybe who's gonna answer?
I can have a... No, David, after you.
Prof. David, maybe?
No, you go for you go first, but I'll just quickly say, yes, I think most students in Australia are pretty safe. What there isn't enough of from the Australian side is facilitating interaction between foreign students and locals. I wish there was much more of that. You go on.
I'd agree completely with that. It's that social interactions. I know at UTS, a lot of international students come together in meeting places on campus because there isn't a lot of interaction with other Australian students. But in general, campuses are safe in terms of health. The universities, I must say, were a little bit slow in responding to COVID. I thought it was a bit of a no-brainer when everything hit the fan that you just, UTS has 35,000 students and 3,000 staff, and I thought it would have been a good idea to just close down, but it took them about 6 weeks to make that decision based on economics, basically. But no, I think that the country's campuses are safe. Except for David's comments, which are very pertinent.
Yes, I think that David's comments about the lack of interaction, I think, it's a long-standing issue. That I did some interviews of Australia Award students who, during their studies in Australia, this was 7 or 8 years ago, and I think one of the most common comments was that in many of the subjects, particularly in economics and engineering and IT, the majority of students in those classes were also international students. So that the possibility of mixing with local students was thereby limited. And I'm not sure that there are any easy answers to that, but I think individual universities, I think, can do much more in trying to encourage international local student interaction and break down some of those barriers created by subject choice and course choice.
Again, there could be the possibility of thinking about setting up a network of Indonesian international students. That could be digital in the first instance, but could then look possibly at arranging social things or online, whatever. That might be another.
Yeah, well, the Indonesian Student Society of Melbourne, in normal, pre-COVID times, was organising seminar discussion on every couple of weeks, every month, which was open to all students, depending on student composition, as often in English as in Indonesian. And I think that seemed to be a good way of encouraging interaction on contemporary issues.
Could I say something?
Yes, of course.
Australia, now since pre-COVID and hopefully after it, Australian students to study in a number of universities in Indonesia, 7 or 8 different universities. And one of the reasons for the success of that program is organising a buddy system, pendamping. Every Australian student gets a pendamping for the first 2 weeks. Some of them like their pendamping and stay on as friends. Some of them doesn't work, but that's okay. At least they get one. I would think that there would be quite a room in Australian universities to organise a pendamping or buddy for overseas students. The Indonesian universities, we just ask students if they'd like to take part. And there are more Indonesian students who offer to take part than we have students to match them with. Schemes like that, I don't think it would be done by governments, but individual universities could relatively easily and at low cost organise such schemes. Thank you.
I'm sorry, the moderator, Mr. Rizky, I think you still unmuted.
Sorry. Thank you for our speaker for the question. We have another question from the participant. Is it from Meita Hasa Eka Wulandari from Universitas Nasional? So Meita asks, we have seen the past relationship, the turbulence, the dynamic, also the growth of the relationship to the business-based strategic partnership such as AA, CEPA, Indonesia and Australia seems to get along well with each other. And as a student, Meita asked more about the other important field, which is education. We know that the thousand of Indonesians were graduate from and currently studying in Australia. To all the honorable speaker, do you think there will be an opportunity for Australia and Indonesia to build a strategic partnership in educational field too? This is the question from Amalia, Meita. Thank you.
If I could start off, and then I'm sure David will have something. David and Paul will have their own ideas. But over the last, now I think 6 years, University of Melbourne and Pusat have been running a Master of International Relations subject on Indonesian foreign policy and politics, which has involved a couple of lectures from Melbourne teaching at Depok on a University of Melbourne curriculum with half the students from Melbourne and half the students from Pusat. And that we've found worked very well in encouraging interaction and bumping between the Melbourne and University of Indonesia students, which has worked very, very effectively. And I think that type of arrangement is perhaps easier to start off just through university cooperation. And the embassy has been very supportive over several years in providing briefings for the 2 groups of students, as Kemlu. So in terms of access to Indonesian foreign policy makers, it's been an excellent program that we've had the opportunity to have as guest lecturers, former foreign ministers, Astan, Martin Nagawa, so that we can do things teaching in Jakarta in a way that's quite impossible to do in Melbourne. And that hasn't been dependent on any government-to-government negotiations, but both the Indonesian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Australian Embassy in Jakarta have been very supportive.
Thank you. Prof. David, please.
Yes, these things are easiest to start university to university. That's certainly true. One or two enthusiastic persons in a enthusiastic person in a university in Indonesia and one in Australia is all that's needed to get something worthwhile going. If you don't have one enthusiastic person on each side, it won't work. But you only need two people to get good programs going. But at the same time, programs like this remain small and small numbers. What we need are bigger numbers. And embassies help, but basically I think there needs to be more help from governments. Now, the Indonesian government and the Australian government are fairly outstanding in that they provide little support for the study of their communities overseas. The French have the Alliance Française, the Goethe Institute, the Erasmus House for European countries, Japan Foundation, but Australia and Indonesia are both latecomers in the idea of supporting their cultures overseas. Indonesia tends to send dancers. Well, dancers are okay, but once you've seen the dance, it's over. There are some initiatives here and there, but really there needs to be a bit more government help, just a couple of millions, small amounts of dollars from either side for Indonesian government to support Indonesian studies in Australia and for the Australian government to go back to what it did in the 1980s well of putting some money into Australian studies in Indonesia. Small initiatives are terrific. Ground up is great, but ground up initiatives rarely involve large numbers. If we want large numbers, there needs to be some attention from government. I'm really surprised that the Indonesian government and the Australian government don't think it's worth supporting the studies of their own countries overseas.
You know, I think that there is the possibility, and in the framework of the Australia Awards, so leaving aside the formal MA and PhD scholarship programs, that there are short programs which I think could be adapted to encourage cooperation between Australian and Indonesian universities in the area of Australian studies, and as you say, with not involving huge amounts of money.
Agreed. A little bit of money would go a long way.
Yeah, exactly. And a couple of years ago, I did some interviewing on what was then called twin site scholarship program. So the students would spend a year doing an MA first year in Indonesia and then in an Australian university. So I think an adaptation of that type of schema might be possible.
Absolutely agree.
But that probably does require some involvement at a government level and certainly at an embassy level. So although the management of the Australian Awards is contracted out, the embassy still has a significant role in how it is managed, and would, on a policy issue like this, need to be involved.
Next question.
Okay, thank you for our speaker, because we are running out of the times, Prof. David Reeve. Astan and Prof. Richard Halfol. Well, thank you so much for you all. I'm glad to you here and give or your view, your perspective for Indonesia and Australia relation. And then I try to summarize this discussion for today. I think that we talked about the Indonesia and Indonesian relation, Indonesia-Australia relation. The past is like Prof. David Reeve said that decade to decade relationship between Indonesia and Australia become better, right? We have a long history, we have a long story between these two countries, and the current issue also Indonesia needs Australia and Australia also needs Indonesia as a geopolitical and geostrategic relationship or cooperation with. We can say that trade, agriculture, energy, education is very significant in the process of the future. Indonesia has strategic partnership, comprehensive with Australia. One of the important things from the partnership is to connecting people to people, not also G2G or government to government. And then we know in the future that we see these two countries that Indonesia is an asset for Australia and also Australia too. Australia believe that Indonesia become richer, powerful in the next 15 years ahead. In terms of I believe that the cooperation and relationship from the Indonesia and Australia become better. I think that's all from me. We discuss and we meet again in the grand launching CFIS. Well, thank you for joining with us. It's been great pleasure to us. Thank you very much. See you in the next event. Maybe Kezia, thank you. We give to Kezia as a MC.
Thank you so much for moderating our session, Mr. Rizky Marman. Give applause to Mr. Rizky Marman for moderating our event today. Once again, on behalf of the committee, we want to thank you for all honorable guests, speaker, and the participating ladies and gentlemen who participate in the study, webinar and soft launching Center for Australia Study, National University, Jakarta, Indonesia. We really appreciated your presence today with us. We are committed on service today. Thank you and apologizing. There are lags during the event. Before that, we are going to have some take a picture with all of the media team. Is that ready for screenshot? Please, everyone, turning on your camera while we are screenshot our Zoom. I see a few people that are not turning on their camera. Please turning on your camera while I'm going to give the instruction for us to take a pictures and screenshot. Are the media team ready? All right, okay. We're gonna take a picture first. And 1, 2, and 3, smile. Another one, 1, 2, and 3, smile. Okay, you are gorgeous. And one more time. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and smile. Thank you, everyone. I'm Gabriela Keisha as the Master of Ceremony today's program, along with the entire committee. On duty, say goodbye to you, all of you. Thank you, and see you next time. Have a nice afternoon in Indonesia, and have a nice evening in Australia time. Stay safe and healthy. God bless us all. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. Terima kasih.
Yes, thanks everyone, and particularly to Richard and David. It was wonderful having you guys with so much experience and knowledge. And I think your idea about that edited collection is great.
Recording stopped.